So good afternoon. My name is Catherine Workman. I am a first-year fellow in the Office of Forestry and Biodiversity at USAID. We have now covered the transnational organized crime and law enforcement. We've covered the wildlife trafficking impacts on food security and global health. So we're going to turn now for our last panel to arguably the toughest part of the issue, if you can believe that, and that is the consumer demand and the socioeconomic drivers of wildlife trafficking. I think our panelists have pretty efficiently covered the depressing statistics associated with wildlife crime. The more than 1,200 rhinos that were killed last year. To bring that down to a single day, that's 8 rhinos slaughtered a day for their horns, largely serving a Vietnamese and Chinese consumer population. The about 35,000 elephants that are killed a year, that's an elephant slaughtered for its tusks every 15 minutes. And again, that's driving largely an East Asian demand. There are the pangolins that are being trafficked by the literal ton. Conservative estimates say 10,000 pangolins a year, but that could be only 10% of the real number, so it could be as much as 100,000 to 200,000 pangolins a year for their meat and for their scales, again, largely for East Asian appetites. And then there are the trafficked parrots, the endangered cockatoos that are stuffed into plastic bottles, the snakes, the fish, the monkeys, the timber, lest we forget the plants, and all the other animals that don't make the splashy headlines. All of this death and slaughter is driving a voracious demand. This is an appetite that has grown exponentially in recent years, and especially in East Asia, largely driven by economic development and a consequent surge in purchasing power that has included demand for luxury commodities to demonstrate social status, to be able to gift that social status, demand for pets, and then some traditional demands like for medicine and for food. East Asia is a primary destination, but lest we become smug here in the West, I think has been described today, the United States of America is also a major demand country for illegal wildlife products. And I think some of our speakers have done a good job of talking about some of the loopholes and the places where our own policies have been problematic, and we need to get our own house in order. On the supply side, wildlife trafficking hinders sustainable social and economic development, and it devastates the natural resource base and those large mammals for tourism, which local communities depend on. I think that was well described in the first panel as well, that the large animals of Uganda, of Tanzania, of Kenya are bringing in a tremendous revenue source to local communities. And without that source, those populations will suffer. So how do we shift consumer demand and alter buying practices? What is the role for policymakers on local, regional, national, and international levels to leverage policies that stem demand and change consumer behavior? How are policies and regulations and social marketing campaigns tailored to different countries, different cultures, different governmental regimes, and different demographic groups? And is stemming demand even possible? We have an excellent panel for you to discuss these questions and many other issues, and we're going to be going from kind of the whole gamut, individual country case studies up to the 30,000-foot global policy levels. You have their bios in your packet, so I won't be exhausted in introducing them, but do know that these 3 speakers are bringing expertise on socioeconomic conditions that is driving wildlife trafficking in source countries where animals are being taken, and also bringing experience from the demand countries where wildlife and wildlife products are headed. First up, we have Grace Gabriel, who is the Regional Director for the International Fund for Animal Welfare, or IFAW, in Asia, where she has been the driving force for IFAW China for many years. And Grace is now, recently, I learned, has relocated to the East Coast, but Grace has decades of experience on the demand side issues in Asia, particularly in China. So please, with your applause, welcome Grace Gabriel.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the organizer for having me here to talk about IFAW's approach, our behavior change campaigns to reduce wildlife trade. Before I get to elephants, I just want to use this species. It's also a victim of commercial exploitation. Tibetan antelope is a CITES Appendix 1 species. It's endemic to Qinghai Tibet Plateau in China, and it was hunted by the thousands at the end of last century to provide a wool to be woven into a luxury shawl, and then that shawl was smuggled into Western markets to be sold for tens of thousands of dollars. And IFAW's campaign to protect Tibetan antelope covered the entire trade chain from poaching to trafficking to demand. We helped Chinese government, the 3 nature reserves where Tibetan antelope live, to form anti-poaching networks. Our campaign persuaded consumers and fashion industry to see chatouche as a shroud rather than a shawl. We developed identification manuals for chatouche to help law enforcement. The U.S. government took Tibetan antelope into the ESA, making domestic trade of chatouche a prosecutable crime. And last but not least, IFAW, working with our partner in India, we shifted the entire industry, 30,000 people, chatouche weaving industry, into using a wool that can be sheared from a mountain goat. And using this, I want to demonstrate the importance of addressing every link on the trade chain of species that are commercially exploited. And IFAW, for those of you who probably know our work, we work to influence policy, to adopt in precautionary principles in policies and national laws. We also build enforcement capacity to enhance the effectiveness of enforcement. We also conduct behavior change campaigns. There are many values attached with elephant ivory in many Asian societies. In China, ivory carving, the elaborately carved ivory, has always been coveted as a status symbol. But in the past, it was really the purview of a privileged few. The economic growth, the dramatic increase in consuming power, combined with the cultural interest to define status, combined with the market availability and accessibility of ivory, really made ivory, people literally tell me they call ivory white gold. And they're used for collecting, decorating, even speculating, and gift-giving. These figures came from China's auction association in the mainland China, doesn't include Hong Kong. It shows you that in 2011, for instance, ivory auction sales volume was $94 million worth, and that was a 170% increase from just a year ago. So is rhino horn. Rhino horn traditionally was used in traditional Chinese medicine, but in China in recent years, what we're seeing is rhino horn it's increasingly these carvings, rhino horn carvings that's used and coveted. And wealth, we found our market monitoring shows that wealth is increasingly overtaking health as the driver of demand. In China. And also, I want to say in Vietnam, for instance, it's still medicinal, but a lot of the things Vietnam are learning from China, and that trend could be shifting to Vietnam as well. This survey from 2011, China's ivory control system requires that every ivory ivory trade outlet need to have a government-issued license, whether you're a carving factory or a retail outlet. And also, every piece of ivory sold on the market needs to have to be accompanied with an ID card. So we visited 158 outlets in 2011. We found that 101 did not have government-issued license. In one antique mall outside of Beijing, we found 22 shops. Only one had a government-issued license. And also, among the 57 that had government-issued license, 60% of them were found to be engaging in illegal laundering of illegal ivory in some way. For instance, withholding the ID card. We found that the ID card itself has become a commodity. And also, what we found is ivory price in Chinese currency had tripled from the year 2006 to 2011. But during those years, Chinese currency gained value against the US dollar. So that means for every Chinese who are going overseas where illegal ivory can be sourced, their Chinese currency can just go so much further. And then if they buy that ivory, smuggle it back into the country, and then sold under the cover of that legal market, the profit margin is huge. CITES 1989 ban of ivory trade, that coincided with China's shift of economy. China was shifting from state enterprise to private economy. So almost all of the ivory carving factories were state-owned, and many of them were starting to shrink down, close down. Old masters decided not to take in new apprentices and resign to just use the leftover stockpile in order to carve these really beautifully carved, elaborate carvings. However, when CITES allowed the second one-off sale to China, that caused so many other private carving factories, retail outlets start applying to get into the trade. And if you go to an ivory carving factory today, what you see is the hand tools are being replaced by electric drills for carving. So the carving quality decreased, and also the availability, accessibility of ivory on the market removed any stigma attached with ivory consumption, and many people take it as legality, that accessibility as legality. And their appreciation shifted from these really beautiful carvings and the skill involved in carving those to ivory as a material. And also, in 2007, IFAW conducted a poll where we found that 70% of the Chinese do not even know ivory comes from dead elephants. Because in Chinese, ivory is xiang ya. Xiang is elephant, ya is teeth. Elephant teeth. So people think people's teeth, fall off or grow back, and you don't die. And that misconception caused a lot of this, misunderstanding and confusion. And so IFAW's campaign, really, our behavior change campaign in China, have been focusing on 3 pillars. And we through policy advocacy, public outreach, and community mobilization, we are reducing both market availability and accessibility and demand. We feel that these 2 parts are so intricately connected, need to be done together. In terms of market availability, we have been working with China's largest online company, Alibaba. Everybody knows Alibaba, but its Chinese subsidiary, Taobao, in Chinese means treasure hunt, Taobao owns the 80% of the market share of the largest, it's actually the largest C2C e-commerce site. And Taobao banned elephant ivory in 2008, before eBay did, in fact. And not only elephant ivory, Taobao banned rhino horn, tiger bone, bear bile, turtle shell, pangolin scale, and even shark fin in 2009. And led by Taobao and Alibaba, more and more websites have taken in a zero tolerance policy against against wildlife trade. And when these products, wildlife products, are put on the prohibited list, prohibited from sale list, people come up with different names. There are 40 different names now to call elephant ivory. So we have to continue monitor market and supply websites with new names so they can continue to enhance that screen to take out infringing listings. And also our information are supplied for law enforcement for market crackdowns. And this research, bi-monthly monitoring of 22 websites shows a sustained reduction of online wildlife trade, at least on these 22 websites. But we are seeing wildlife trade is shifting to, for instance, social media sites, which is a lot harder to monitor. In December 2011, we saw an auction house was going to sell off 400 bottles of tiger bone wine, plus ivory and rhino horn carvings in a hotel not far from our office. So we supplied the information to law enforcement, and in fact, they prohibited that auction. And following that, Chinese government issued a notice to all of the auction houses prohibiting them from selling ivory, rhino horn, and tiger bone. And that resulted in a 40% reduction in auctions sales volume in mainland China, representing $322 million worth in 2012. And this research from Gao Yufang in Yale University shows he took out ivory carving and saw that dramatic drop of ivory carving from that ban. And he compared that with pike data. And it was interesting. It would be interesting to see, where that chart, that data continue to go, but it seems to correlate with the pike reduction of elephant poaching. Also, stigmatizing ivory consumption through destruction, it is so important. When countries, from along the entire trade chain start to destroy ivory, it sends such a strong message to the consumers. And also, countries, countries can set models, set examples for others. When US government destroyed 6 tons of ivory, less than 2 months later, China destroyed 6.1 ton of ivory. So that survey where we found 70% of the people didn't know ivory come dead elephants, 82% said that if they had known, they would not consume ivory. So that was really, heartening for me to know that Chinese are not prejudiced against ivory, or against elephants, sorry. And so this campaign, we started this campaign right after Olympics in 2009. This is a dialogue between the baby elephant and the mother. Baby is saying, Mom, I have teeth. Mom, I have teeth. Aren't you happy I have teeth? And then we explain why elephant babies having teeth meant for elephant families. And when we send this ad out to testing for ad agencies for their comment, many of them led by agency giant JC de Gaulle in China came back and said, we want to help you put this ad across the country. And they did. They put it in subways, airports, on trains, on buses, buildings, literally across the country. And many of the media agencies came to us and put it on phone cards, in magazines. And China's Education Bureau official took a picture of our ad. They didn't even come and ask for a high-resolution one, and they just took a picture and put it into college entrance exam, into the Chinese language test. And that subsequently reached 9 million college applicants. And so in 2011, after the campaign ran for 5 years, we decided to test it, and we found that the ad had penetrated 75% of the urban Chinese population, and it also reduced the group with the most propensity to purchase ivory from 54% to 26%. And currently, I'm working with Dr. Li and trying to further analyze the data and understand what kind of messaging can reduce people's intention to purchase ivory. And other than pulling on people's heartstrings, we develop other campaign ads. This ad was first ran in Dubai, designed by IFA's Dubai office. And when it ran in Dubai airport, it says ivory smuggling leads to prosecution. But in China, there is a legal trade. Not every transaction leads to prosecution. So what we have done is in the ivory bracelet is the Chinese word 有形, having status, and the word in the handcuff is also Chinese, 有形, having sentence, reminding people engaging in ivory trade could lead to prosecution. And every Chinese character is pictogram. So for animals, they look like that animal. So what we have done is we took out the tusk from the word for elephant. We took out the bone from a tiger. We took out the gallbladder from a bear. And then we also took out half of a human. And we asked, if we mutilate animals this way, aren't we beings without humanity? And those are messages from an NGO. We feel that it's not enough. Even though, it's all over the country, it's not enough. We need to have key opinion leaders from different segments of society, different professions to help us. And so these are the key opinion leaders that have joined our campaign. Many of them are proposing for legislative change, influence policy. Many of them use their power to influence their fans, peers, families, and friends. And I have some of the ads, but I just want to show you one, which is this is a guy who is antique. He has his own show, Antique Roadshow, China's Antique Roadshow.
对于喜欢收藏的人，最高兴的莫过于找到自己最心爱的宝贝。对于宝贝，藏家应该取之有道。象牙制品对于你只是手中的一件把件，但是它却是夺取大象生命得来的。人不需要象牙，只有大象需要。请不要抢走大象的宝贝。
When he heard about our campaign, he came to us. He says, I want to help you promote these messages. And so these are, I feel, this talk is talking about demand campaigns and policy. I feel that demand reduction campaigns definitely can influence policy if the messages are culturally appropriate, politically sensitive, locally relevant, and socially motivating. And not only when they influence policy, they influence policy at different segments of society, not just government. Some of the private companies, they can have set their own policy to ban wildlife trade online, and some of those bans are stronger than China's wildlife protection law. And also, it has increased political will to address the issue. Sometimes government, banning wildlife trade from certain segments helps stigmatize consumption. And also, these ads generate tremendous support from Chinese private sector. They, on average, we get about 19 million US dollars worth of in-kind from Chinese companies just running these ads. And also, these companies are providing us with technology. For instance, if you get on Sogou, Sogou is a search engine. If you get on Sogou and type in ivory in Chinese, you will get a pop-up telling you do not purchase ivory and also report illegal activities. And a company, this is a program supported by USAID in the AAAS program. A company helped us develop the augmented reality elephant, so we can take this elephant to communities in urban communities. Many people have never seen an elephant, for them to interact with elephant. And while demand reduction campaign influence policy, but I can't emphasize enough how policy decisions either can cause disaster, stimulate demand, or strong, clear policies combined with vigorous enforcement and also meaningful penalties for violators can stigmatize consumption and reduce demand. Thank you very much.
Thank you again to the organizers, to Catherine, Roberto, and also Daphne, and to all of you, all of the panelists here today. It's really an honor to be here with all of you, and especially Grace and Valerie. So I'll be brief, as I'm excited to get started on the discussion, and actually I'm going to propose more questions than answers at this stage. So I'm from the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. We're a research center that transforms knowledge from diverse sources into actions that conserve both biological and cultural diversity. And my background is that I'm a conservation biologist by training, but I've incorporated frameworks and methods from anthropology, economics, policy analysis into my research to inform the investigation of complex or wicked conservation problems, as we might call this one. So my organization has worked in Vietnam for 20 years, at first documenting biodiversity and new species, providing training for students and practitioners, and support for the establishment of protected areas. But recently, when I joined the center, we started a new research program on wildlife trafficking in Vietnam because of rising concern by our partners there, specifically about key knowledge gaps about the nature of trade, and with the hope that together we could fill those gaps to help improve enforcement and inform strategies to curb consumer demand. Vietnam, as Catherine mentioned, is often cited as the most important country after China regarding demand for wildlife products. However, Vietnam is a bit different in that it's not only a demand country, but also a source country and a transit country for wildlife trafficking from other parts of Southeast Asia or even farther away in Africa to markets in East Asia and beyond, including China, Russia, and Japan, which I'll mention more later, and the United States. There's been a lot of recent attention in the media to the situation, especially in Vietnam, highlighting two of the key problems which have been mentioned all day: weak governments and weak law enforcement, despite a relatively strong legal framework for species protection from wildlife trade, illicit wildlife trade, and Vietnam being a part of CITES. It has been reported that many of those trafficking wildlife almost always escape punishment in Vietnam, unless they can be charged with something else that is taken a bit more seriously. And this is broadly the case, but from our research, we do know that there is more enforcement than there used to be 5 years ago, but that's not saying very much. Another key problem is, of course, corruption, which has also been mentioned a lot today. For example, after confiscations of especially coveted animals like pangolins, officials have been known to sell wildlife back into the market, which is, of course, a major issue. And yes, these are huge issues, and much of the work to date on wildlife trade in Vietnam has focused on these key issues. But underneath them lies a very dynamic and complex market and landscape of consumer demand that would be extremely difficult for policy to tackle, even if these major issues were removed. And that's what I'd like to discuss for just a few minutes. So in our research in Vietnam, we're asking what drives illicit wildlife trade at different scales. To answer this question, at least preliminarily, we're focusing on a specific group of highly traded nocturnal primates that many of you may not have ever heard of. I hope so, though. The slow lorises. We focused on them because wildlife trade is a major threat to them. Although habitat loss is an issue, they do quite well in degraded forest. So we know wildlife trade is a major threat. They're also very under-enforced. Their protection is the least enforced of any other traded primate in Vietnam. And they're subject to local, regional, and international demand for diverse uses, which I'll bring up later, and can therefore illustrate the dynamic complexity of trade in space and time that we're interested in. However, of course, several other plants and animals fit these characteristics, and we're expanding to include other trade-targeted species groups through partners in Vietnam, especially Dr. Mainland. So we started this project with forensics. We built a DNA barcoding database to understand pattern, scale, direction of trade, and to support enforcement by matching the DNA of confiscated animals to our reference database. And while we continue this extremely important work in doing it, we realized this effort alone was not enough to understand the complexity of these markets. And we began to include socioeconomic and anthropological data collection to our research to get an idea of what was going on. And we're also working to build local capacity to do more of this kind of multidisciplinary research on trade, which we think is extremely important. So we have a lot of exciting preliminary results from this ongoing work. I'm not going to share too much of it here because it's going to be published. But in brief, we're finding that the cultural and socioeconomic factors contributing to consumer demand and to participation in trade is quite different at local or rural scales, for example, in a village inside or near a protected area like this one, versus what we're calling an elite urban or a tourist scale of the market. So for example, we're finding that lorises are traded locally actually quite rarely and ad hoc. It's very opportunistic to neighbors, to people they know, used for a wide variety of reasons, several different medicinal uses that differs based on where that particular village is and the ethnic group that we talk to. They're also traded as pets, for meat, for religious reasons, a wide diversity. But at the elite, at the urban scale, and in the tourist market, specific orders are often put in for specific types of animals for a narrower range of purposes, especially medicinal purposes, but also for the pet trade, especially to Russia and to Japan. And there's an elaborate underground network where orders are put in either through the internet or through a specific middleman who goes out to an area and an outsider goes in to a particular protected area to get the animals on that order. The reported prices are very different at these two different scales as well, and our hypothesis is that they're really two distinct markets. But the question is, how are these markets related? Is one of them a more powerful driver than another for species loss? We're still working to collect the ecological and genetic data to answer that question. But another question I want to raise today is how does and should policy address both of these markets in different ways? Keeping in mind that the drivers are intertwined with culture and livelihoods, as well as complex histories of displacement, power relationships, globalizations, and a very complex relationship with China, as Grace mentioned. In addition, what should be done beyond policy for demand reduction? So in Vietnam, there are growing efforts at public service announcements and ads, mostly focused on the rhino horn trade and higher profile animals than the lorises I talked about today, and sometimes featuring famous pop stars, as I'm showing here. And I want to highlight Grace's work as a model that should be applauded, that focuses on locally and culturally relevant and engaged efforts. And something she didn't mention today is that she's also worked with traditional medicine practitioners in China, engaging them rather than alienating them. And this is really a key lesson to learn. So in order to do more of these kinds of efforts, we need more multidisciplinary investigation, including artists, including media specialists, as well as both social and natural scientists together, co-creating projects with local partners to guide these efforts, and especially in the culturally diverse and economically complex places like Vietnam. And to answer really key questions, who should these efforts be targeting? How can they reach diverse actors, people in local villages, urban elites, tourists who are coming from all over the world? Will they reach the most crucial consumers? And how important are these efforts in parallel with the enforcement and corruption issues that we've been talking about today? With that, with more questions than answers, as I promised, I look forward to discussing more with all of you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mary. And girly. So finally, we have Dr. Valerie Hickey, who is the practice manager of the World Bank Group's Environment and Natural Resources Global Practice, where, among many other things, she represents the World Bank in international conventions related to biodiversity. Please welcome Valerie Hickey.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you to the organizers. This is an absolutely wonderful opportunity, and I only wish I had been able to come here for the whole day. And I actually apologize to Grace for coming in late to your presentation, but as I was leaving the bank, we had a shelter-in-place drill, which means they physically don't let you out of the building. So it was a great experience for me in law enforcement, because I did try and get out and was stopped by a big man with a big gun. So I do apologize. I wanted to just spend a couple of minutes today, because like Mary, I really do want to focus on the discussion, talking about some of the drivers of wildlife trafficking, but I want to start by talking about the drivers of the World Bank's interest in this issue. I'm a conservation biologist by training, but I'm a bureaucrat by practice. And I work for the largest development institution in the world, and we only care about ending poverty. That's our goal. We have to end extreme poverty, and we have to boost the prosperity of the bottom 40% in every country. So elephants are dying, yeah, that's terrible, but how is that our business? Rhinos are dying, yeah, that's bad. But again, it's not about poor people, right? So we've spent the last several years at the World Bank looking at the socioeconomic drivers that make this our business and make it clear that we can't get to zero poverty unless we make this issue of wildlife trafficking our business. Let me just give you a few key headline numbers. The first one has to do with deaths and the rapid escalation in the industrial poaching that's going on. So I know you've heard all of this all day, but I just want to very quickly remind us. 13 rhinos poached in 2008, 3 a day last year. 3 elephants an hour last year. That's serious killing. But again, elephants and rhinos, not really the World Bank's business, right? 1,000 rangers killed in the last 10 years in just 35 countries. That's 1,000 people murdered. There's about 5,000 rangers have been killed in the last decade across the world. That's 5,000 families, some of the poorest countries, who are bereft of their main breadwinner. Okay, that's getting closer to our business. I think about that number because I'm Irish, and in my country, just over 3,000 people died in what we call the Troubles over 30 years. And there was an entire global effort to stop that because 3,000 murdered people is too much. This is 5,000 murdered rangers. So we have to care about this issue. But now we're going to get into some other numbers that are much more core to what we do. We're economists at the end of the day. Economic damage from environmental crime every year costs developing countries $70 billion. That's the global revenues every year of Nestle, the biggest food and beverage company in the world. You look at me, you know I know food, so I know Nestle. That's an awful lot of money. They employ 350,000 people. So if we just make that very simplistic comparison, wildlife crime, environmental crime, is costing 350,000 jobs a year. Again, in the poorest countries, where that's 350,000 jobs that per job would support about 10 people. It's 3.5 million people every year who can't put food on the table, who don't have a job, who don't have a pathway to prosperity. That's why this stuff matters to us. We've been talking a lot about Ebola at the World Bank over the past year. We know why. It's a terrible, terrible tragedy. But in the 3 countries most affected by Ebola, if you look at Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, every year, stolen fish mean that the government loses $145 million in revenue. That's wildlife trafficking. $145 million may not sound like a lot, but that would equip and run 800 Ebola beds every year. That would mean there wouldn't be an Ebola epidemic anymore. And that's just from one product out of those countries, one wildlife commodity. So these are numbers that really, really matter. So for us at the bank, the economic and social demands that are making poor people today more poor and are actually catalyzing tomorrow's poverty makes this our issue. And of course, in the reverse, those numbers are really big, but what that also means is the financial numbers are very big. Grace talked about the cost, the price for ivory, for rhino horn. You can get rich really quick if you can get your hands on some ivory and some rhino horn. Not to mind on pangolins or pythons or anything else, rosewood, fish. So there's a huge financial incentive for bad guys and gals to get involved in this sector. So we want to be involved in it because there's a poverty reason to be involved in it, there's an economic and social resilience reason to be involved in it. The bad guys are involved because there's a real financial incentive, but they're also involved because of the complexity of this sector. I know we always compare the wildlife trafficking sector to the drug sector, to the arms sector. It's different in some ways, and here's a couple of the ways that make it different and make it much more complex to solve, no matter how much we want to solve it, no matter how big the institutions who want to solve it. The first is that wildlife is wholly undervalued. We know this. What's the value of an elephant? What's the value of a rhino? We don't know yet. We haven't been able to tell that. So we've been spending a lot of time at the World Bank trying to think through what are the economic tools we need to develop so that countries can value this asset. It is an asset. We need to be able to value it. But we also don't know where the elephants are, and we don't know how many we have. If you don't know how much money is in your wallet, you don't know where your wallet is, how on earth do you know if somebody took money out of it? You don't. This is an issue in our sector. And I know an awful lot of people are putting a lot of money into different censuses, censi today. I know there's some great databases out there that are looking at this issue, but we don't have concrete numbers. Governance communities, they don't know. An awful lot of these species are unguarded. So the wonderful thing about wildlife is it's wild. We're not talking about farm animals. Except in some countries and some places, they're not all fenced in. And even where they are fenced in, there aren't a lot of guards, there aren't a lot of rangers. There aren't a lot of people who can protect them. So they're unguarded. And then they're unowned. Nobody owns them. If nobody owns it, nobody really cares whether it's stolen or not. And again, that's why it's so critical we involve local communities and we get government back at the center of this discussion. But these are some of the complexities that make wildlife trafficking such low-hanging fruit for those bad guys and bad girls who've decided to make a lot of money very quickly. And so what are we doing? As a community, there's been a myriad of policy responses, both to deal with the complexity issues, to deal with the financial incentive that exists around wildlife crime, and to deal with some of the basic law enforcement and corruption issues that really allow this to happen. I mean, I've talked a little bit about the sort of natural capital accounting that's going on to try and value wildlife in a much different way. Places like Botswana, for example, we're working with the government to do tourism accounts, to show them what their investment in elephant protection and wildlife protection and park management means for tourism dollars. There's elephant census, there's investment in park systems. At the bank alone, we spend about $300 million a year in protected area management in developing countries, and we're just one small player in this. So there's a lot of investment to try and reduce that sense that wildlife is out there, it's wild, it's unowned, it's unguarded. In terms of the financial incentives, there's a lot of work being done to change the balance of the risk-reward framework, to make the rewards smaller and the risks higher. To make the rewards smaller, of course, we're working with folks like Grace at IFAW, with a lot of other folks to think about demand reduction, and not just through campaigns, but through regulation. This is something that WCS drives home again and again. You can ask people to be nice and don't be involved in bad behavior. You can also arrest them and fine them when they are involved in bad behavior, and you need a mix of both. We're also working very hard on anti-money laundering initiatives. At the end of the day, wildlife crime is a crime of the wealthy, not of the poor. And we don't want to criminalize poverty. We don't want to arrest and criminalize and prosecute the man or woman who has no other way to make money and put food on his table other than to help a poacher, go out and show him where the elephants are. This is not Dickensian England, where we're going to arrest the poor beggar kid because they don't have a choice. So what we're doing is deploying anti-money laundering tools so that we can seize the assets of the kingpins and the queenpins, who at the end of the day drive this trade. And the minute they begin to worry that they're going to lose their house in the Alps and their boat in a Miami marina, they're really going to start thinking about whether this is worth it. And then, of course, there's the work on law enforcement and the work on anti-corruption, and really trying to build capacity from crime scene to the courthouse, from rangers through police, through prosecutors and judges, to really make the whole system work. But I'm just going to end with a couple of challenges that we have to think about, and these are ones that we really need as a community to think through. One is there's an awful lot of ideas chasing not a lot of money. There's a lot of divergent discussions. We have to start converging the discussions. We have to put governments and the people whose assets are being stolen and robbed and whose jobs are being destroyed and whose futures are being destroyed back at the center of the discussion. We can't have simply conservation organizations front-facing for this issue. We need to have the governments at the center. We need to have the communities at the center. There's been a growth in what I call entrepreneurial law enforcement, vigilantism. A lot of people, because they've lost trust in government, believe that what we'll do is we'll take it on ourselves to enforce laws. It's simply adding to the insecurity, it's adding to the instability, it's adding to the poor governance that is at the root cause of many of these problems. So again, how are we going to deal with this? How do we put power back in the hands of government without losing any kind of efficiency? And then how do we make sure that we do all of this together and that we do it now? Because there aren't going to be elephants left in 10 years to worry about. There aren't going to be rhinos left in 30 years. Nobody knows how many pangolins there are, so we don't know if we're going to run out of them next year or in 100 years. So we need to do this now. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Brian Gratwick. I'm from the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute. My question's for you, Valerie. You spent a bit of time at the beginning trying to sort of justify why this was part of the World Bank's concern. And I do read the Millennium Development Goals and some of the annual reports, and I've noticed that when you get to the environmental section, it's just like, oh, we've got some excuses, but then you read the rest of the report and it's like, child poverty is down, child survivorship is up, child nutrition is up, education's doing great. And I just see the environmental section and it just seems to be an ignored bit. And I just wondered if you could comment how that relates to the World Bank's mission.
Do you want me to go ahead and answer, Catherine? So we've learned an awful lot from what we did in the MDGs, where we had an MDG goal 8 on environmental sustainability. It was standalone, and that allowed everybody to ignore it and focus on what they felt were important issues, which are important issues. Child poverty, access to food, access to water, access to energy. We're now putting together the whole UN system, the entire world, the Sustainable Development Goals. And we're doing something very different, which is we have 2 environment-related goals, one terrestrial, one marine, but we also have indicators on environment in the food security goal, in the access to energy goal. So we're really thinking about how do we learn the lessons from the MDGs to ensure that governments can't ignore this. They can't send a signal to donors that what we want to do is make progress on food security, which is critical. We need to feed 9 billion people by 2050. We've no idea what we're putting on for dinner for them. They're coming here soon. We need to figure that out, but we're not going to get there if we don't think about environment. So we have to include in the food security goal attention to environment. And that includes not just attention to wildlife resources like fish, but also to other wildlife resources. In the most stubborn pockets of poverty, people also need access to food. The protein they're getting is largely from the wild. How do we think about helping them? How do we think about replacing that if that's what we need to do? And so that's what we're trying to learn at the World Bank. We're trying to help governments think through how do they get to their primary goal, which is to alleviate their poverty, to grow, to become more wealthy nations, which is something we should all celebrate and hope for. But how do they do it in a way that's not grow now, clean up later? That's not grow now by liquidating our wildlife resources, and then we just create poverty tomorrow. And that's what we're trying to do with the SDGs.
Go over to this side.
Hi, this is Sherman De Silva again, also from the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute and from Trunks and Leaves. And I have two questions which are kind of interrelated. So the first question relates to something Mary asked in an earlier panel about, some of these markets have been around for a very long time. How are things different now than from 100 years ago? So I was just at a conference for the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation, Asia section in Cambodia. And one of the things that I learned is that one of the differences is that whereas people may have been subsistence hunting for a long time, now there's a lot of commercial hunting, commercially driven hunting, like what you talked about. And so from Gabriel's talk, it's really inspiring to see the results of the efforts that IFAW has put in for particular target species. But we have so many different species being hunted that we don't really have time to go species by species, one by one, and nor would it really succeed, right? Because the public would stop listening at some point. So how do we, tackle everything together? Because it seems like we don't have time to just, address charismatic species by species, right? And some of it is driven by these, global relationships. So, for example, construction, projects and things like that that are in countries that have foreign workers that then create demand where demand was never there domestically in the first place. So I'm from Sri Lanka originally. Wildlife are being hunted that never were hunted before because there has been outside demand for it. And then to the World Bank, it's clear that the World Bank really gets it now. But I've also learned at this conference that there is an emerging sort of threat from private banks, new banks, that don't have the same stringency in environmental requirements and the same goals, and that poses a threat because if you don't need funding from the World Bank, you can turn to these. If you have other sources of money for your projects and whatnot, you can ignore those requirements. So these are interrelated problems. I'd like to hear everyone's thoughts on those.
Who wants to start? Grace and Mary, do you want to take the first question?
I think earlier speaker talked about, the elephants and rhinos. These are, flagship species, and use them as a way to galvanize support for conservation in general, and not just, not just one species. And if people realize if they have a relationship with a certain species, and they will spill over, and I hope, and I have seen education, particularly in younger children, education area, if you make them have more, empathy or compassion for other, if you use elephants or tigers or whatever, and they will have empathy and compassion for other species. So I don't know if I answered that.
I can speak to it as well. I think some others have mentioned that there's probably different pathways and different trade trains for different animal groups. And what I talked about today is that there's also people use the same animal for completely different reasons. And so it's extremely complex. And at the same time that we want to spread awareness, we also don't want to, negate someone's cultural value that they've had for hundreds of years either. And so something that I'm really interested in is who is really driving the trade, who do the policies need to really focus on, and does empowering local communities, as you mentioned, to perhaps protect against outsiders if they have values that they really connect with. We can use culturally relevant and locally relevant informed efforts to really improve upon this. And I don't know, if you wanted to talk about that the traditional medicine case, remember when you talked about this at SCB Asia in Malaysia, where there was, in China, there's a certification program to be a traditional medicine practitioner, and you convince them to switch certain things, remember?
Am I making it up? But we did work with traditional, Chinese medicine practitioners, particularly in 1993 when the U.S. had the Pele Amendment, and that really got a lot of country start. Oh wow, these species are already protected, and we need to do something about them. And China, it was in 1993, China put rhino horn and banned rhino horn and tiger bone use in traditional Chinese medicine. Combining with the law, in fact, Chinese government had persuaded the Chinese medicine practitioners to start looking for alternatives and do not use medicine. And they did. They shifted to alternatives. In fact, in 2006, I remember Trafficking had a research, and they took a tiger bone prescription with tiger bone in it, and they visited a few hundred TCM shops in China, and they only found 2% said that they can fill that prescription. But what's driving the tiger trade now are these, in fact, it is again policy. China's wildlife law is really a wildlife utilization law. It does not take animals or wildlife's biodiversity role into consideration. And so that under that law, people can raise tigers in large numbers and just to use them for trade. And China has the largest tiger farms. And despite CITES laws or regulations, and despite China's own domestic that policy not to use tiger bone and rhino horn in medicine, but these tiger farms still stimulate demand.
And I think this is one of the challenges that we also have to grapple with, is all wildlife trade is not illegal. In fact, most of it is legal. And in fact, most of it is very important for countries. Done sustainably, it can fund development, it can fund prosperity. And it's important to think through, how do you begin to help consumers get smarter about making decisions? We think this is another country issue, but how many of us are going to go out this weekend and go to a restaurant and order fish? We're not really sure what the fish is. We're just going to go by the menu name. We're not really sure, is this fish legal? Is it being harvested sustainably? So imagine how much more difficult it is for people who aren't going to restaurants with very nice menus, but are in markets. And Grace put something up in a slide that I thought was really succinct when she said availability equals legality. If it's available, most people assume it's illegal. It's legal. So this is where I think another challenge we have to deal with. On the issue of banking and financing, this is where we have to turn the conversation around. And instead of looking for each of the bad actors who may have permissive policies, is start working with the governments who license and regulate all the banks to make sure they're imposing particular standards. And this has been happening a lot through initiatives like the Equator Principle, for example. It's happening in a lot of countries, including China, where the Chinese banking industry is really trying to work to think about how do we improve our banking practices to make sure that we are not lending money to corrupt practices. And that's happening all over the world. And so again, I think that's what we need to do, is put pressure on governments, put them back at the center of the conversation so that they can begin to use their regulatory power to change bad behavior. And they can use their regulatory power on the other end to say no thank you to money that's going to come in and undermine their good governance.
Thanks. I am shutting it down. Sorry, Kim. No, we're going to have to move on. But I told y'all this was arguably going to be the toughest, kind of naughtiest portion of the day. And I think there's a lot to bring into the reception networking piece tonight. So thank our panel, and thanks for your participation.